For 20 years, we've been creating innovation in the CX industry, and now we're seeking out brilliant new perspectives on CX you just won't find anywhere else. I'm Richard Owen. Welcome to the CX Iconoclast. In this episode, I have the pleasure of interviewing Dean Eckles, tenured MIT professor and former Facebook researcher, on how people interact with misinformation as well as data online. Dean shares his notable 2021 Twitter field experiment, which found that correcting users for posting false information can actually sometimes backfire, leading them to share even more low-quality, hyper-partisan content. He explains how social corrections, like fact-checking links or community notes, can reduce the spread of misinformation, but mainly by influencing more peripheral users rather than the original poster. While some users delete misleading content when corrected, others actually double down, illustrating the complex dynamics of how online information sharing and the cognitive load of managing reputations shape in a very chaotic digital environment. For CX professionals, our conversation shifts to survey bias and decision-making, drawing on Dean's work at Facebook. He explains how platforms with vast telemetry data, like Meta, I should say Meta, not Facebook, can adjust survey results to better reflect the broader population, unlike most companies with fragmented customer data. We explore how generative and predictive AI can help fill in some of those data gaps, enabling more accurate modeling in data-poor environments, and discuss the persistent challenges of getting decision makers to trust data that contradicts experience-based instincts. Dean suggests that true progress lies in improving the complementarity between humans and AI. Stop me if you've heard this before, but I think he expresses it very eloquently. AI doesn't just assist or match human decisions, but enhances them beyond either working alone one way or the other. He does, however, suggest there remains a rare outcome in practice, and improved human-AI collaboration is going to be a major frontier both today and in the future. I do hope you enjoy our conversation. All right, Dean, well, thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate you taking some time out of your schedule to join us on the CX Iconoclast.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
So, I have this bias. We have a fair number of MIT people on the podcast. This must be, for some reason, I'm biased towards MIT. I can't imagine why. But you've also had experience at Stanford as well, and you've had real world experience, as we like to say to people who patronizingly people who work in academia, with Facebook, amongst other places. But one of the things that caught our eye, and certainly when Morris was researching our conversation, he picked up on, was this 2021 paper you'd written. And I'm going to read this out because the title is in of itself worth mentioning here. Perverse Consequences of Debunking in a Twitter Field Experiment, : being corrected for posting false news increases subsequent share of low quality, partisan, and toxic content. That in of itself is an article. You don't need to go any further than the title. It says it all. So what is that about? Because that, first of all, very interesting work, but perhaps you could explain to the audience what you were working on there.
Yeah, so we've done a lot of work on kind of the spread of misinformation and low quality information online, and more generally rumors. Sometimes rumors turn out to be true, actually. So things that maybe it's not certain whether they're true yet. And we've been looking at this for a while, including some of it back when I was still working at Facebook. We were studying these cascades of rumors, some true, some false, some a mix, some who knows, online. And one of the things that we had seen there just observationally is that if you look at cases where I've shared something, maybe it's dubious, and someone replies to it with a link to a fact-checking website. In that case, we were looking at Snopes, which is one of these fact-checkers. That it seemed like after somebody posted a link to Snopes saying, hey, this is false, the propagation of that content was slowing down. I'm going to get fewer reshares, fewer retweets, basically, once somebody has slapped a link to something that kind of corrects what I'm saying. So in some ways, that suggested this promising approach to improving the quality of what's spreading online, right? Is that people's friends or their social circles online or people who are somehow getting exposed to this content, they might do some of the correction or exposing the original poster to that kind of a correction. And we observed also that the original posters would sometimes delete their content, and they were deleting it at higher rates when they were getting these links to things saying, hey, this is false. And so that suggests this kind of promising approach where not only is it kind of other viewers of this might see this additional context, and that could affect whether they propagate it, but the person who originally posted it might say, maybe this isn't true, and I prefer to be sharing accurate information, or at least I don't want to be staking my reputation and in this interaction with people online on something that kind of seems pretty dubious. And so they might just delete the post. So that seems like a promising approach in some ways. It's like maybe improving information quality online by people's own lights, which is something that we've explored in multiple ways, right? Rather than saying, okay, we're going to be entirely reliant on the platforms or external fact checking, right? That it's going to be at the end, the people who are posting and propagating things, that they're going to be actually convinced and persuaded and say, even by my own judgment, I don't know that this is true, or I don't know that I want to be propagating this. So it seems promising, but this paper that you highlight is basically how that may not always work, right? That there can be perverse consequences of these kinds of social corrections as well. And that it could instead be the jumping off point for basically a kind of intensification of sharing of hyperpartisan content, a lot of which is not very reliable. So yeah, what we did in that work, which we've done a few times, is basically that we're posting corrections to people, just using some kind of otherwise unexciting bots that we create on social media, and that are online and seeing when people are sharing some information that we know, hey, there's this fact check related to that. What if we reply with that fact check? What's going to happen? And you kind of hope that not only does something useful happen with that content right there, but that this might have a broader effect on those users' sharing decisions. But that's not really what seems to happen, or at least not in the right direction.
Maybe not yet.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be the argument that we're basically so much still in our infancy. We don't think of it this way, but we're in our infancy in terms of dealing with spread of information through these kind of social networks, right? So we've got, I don't know, hundreds of years of the printed book or the newspaper as a sort of source of information, curated and organized by professionals. And you may agree or disagree with the perspective on journalistic intent or quality, but it's nevertheless curated content. And the brand of the periodical is essentially the thing that people stand behind. If you're reading a piece from The Economist, then The Economist means something. It means something in terms of quality, whether you agree or disagree with their conclusions. And now we're in the social media world where everyone is a publisher. And surely at the end of the day, the objective here is to rebuild that sort of reputational integrity. So individuals who publish high quality develop reputations for high quality. Individuals who don't. And we as a society have to find our way to navigating the distinction, right? We have to simply learn how to process brand as an individual level. Well, if I'm reading material from this person versus that person, I'm going to pay a lot of attention to this person because their brand stands for thoughtful, high integrity work. And this person, well, they're just flamethrowing. And we haven't quite figured out how to do that yet. That's new territory, is it?
Well, and some of it is just maybe really cognitively difficult. There's a lot more brands there to be keeping track of than if you're thinking about a relatively small number of news outlets, where a lot of the time I don't have to keep track of the specific journalist. I can keep track of the outlet. In some cases, you don't even know the specific journalist, like the example of The Economist. They don't use bylines, right? So it's all about this central brand. Whereas hey, if I am following hundreds of people on a social media platform, it could be hard to keep track of all of them and what their reputation should be with me, and then also all the people that they might be propagating content from, or other content that's getting inserted into my feed, because increasingly we're seeing, even on networks where people have these social connections, like, on X or on Facebook, more and more of people's content in their feed is out of network content, right? That X is just saying, hey, you don't follow this person. Nobody you follow retweeted them, but we're going to put this into your feed. And the same is happening elsewhere. And, some platforms like TikTok are basically all that, right? That it's sort of all the recommendation system stuff, the stuff that the recommendation system is putting in your feed. So this might be the first time that you see something from this person. So whether you take really literally some of the research by, Robin Dunbar about the kind of limits of how many people we can keep track of the limits on group size, as, extrapolating from, the size of different primates' brains to the size of our brain, right? He says, hey, maybe we can only keep track of 150 people, but certainly online, you're encountering content from way more people than that. So trying to keep track of their brand in terms of reputation, it's very difficult without help.
We're either going to recognize that content is curated for us or we self-curate, right? And, it doesn't take you long to figure out that everything is algorithmically driven now, right? If you switch on your YouTube channel is putting content in front of you that's an algorithm based on what you've seen previously. Now, even at a level of awareness that says everything is an algorithm and therefore, I want to be cautious about anything that is curated for me, is probably something we're going to develop as a tool. What did the research tell you about the most effective ways to communicate on topics that are controversial, right? I mean, are there some lessons about how we can give, let's not say bad news, but we can communicate things which may not fit in with people's pre-existing views?
So I think it's worth distinguishing like what the effect of some intervention that's like a correction like this is for the person who originally shared content versus in aggregate. Because these corrections can still sort of work in aggregate in that the person who shared it, they may have a really particularly strong perspective, and this social correction is not going to get them to reconsider their perspective. And it might even cause them to double down on sort of how they're interacting online. But for all the people who are following them and getting exposed to the content, it still could be beneficial. So I do want to be clear that like this doesn't necessarily say that these kind of social corrections don't work, but they may not work for that person and for the people right around them. So actually there's this new paper out about the effects of community notes on in particular on X, but now community notes are coming to Meta platforms, which is where general users can use a special mechanism not just to reply to a post, but to say, hey, here's a note that needs to be added. It might be it's a fact check, but it could be, hey, here's some context like that is really important for interpreting this. And then if enough people from a diverse enough set of kind of political or partisan allegiances are upvoting that, then it gets shown. And so it's sort of very much like this kind of social correction, but with a little of a stronger mechanism, both that if it is shown, it's like really more prominent, and also that it's not any one person can just sort of post it. You need to have this whole voting process. So those community notes, if you slap a post with a community note, what happens? Well, they find that it really does have this pretty dramatic effect on the subsequent sharing of that content. Drops a lot. But most of that is driven by people who are kind of far away from the original poster sharing it. So sometimes we talk about cascades of content spreading being wide or deep. If it's wide, it's closer to broadcast. It's like, hey, a lot of people follow you, and so when you post something, like a lot of people are going to retweet it, and a lot of those people are interacting with it and seeing it. Whereas a deep cascade would be like, okay, you post something, somebody reposted, another person reposted, etc. And so it's reaching parts of the network that are really far away from you. And what they find is that it's really reducing this kind of depth of these cascades. It's making them kind of less structurally viral in that way. And that makes a lot of sense, that like it's some of these kind of corrections or additions of context are not about like changing the minds of the people who are really initiating the propagating of this content. It's about sort of providing more information, more context for people who are a little bit more on the margin of, wait, I don't know this original poster, or I've forgotten who they are even, right? As we were talking about, right? Maybe I should know who they are, but I don't remember. But hey, here's this additional piece of context, and now I'm a little more skeptical. Now I'm maybe not going to propagate this.
Right, and to some extent, that's the audience that's open to persuasion. Anyway, so there's some benefit there.
Yeah, and I'd say, sort of in that broad vein, a lot of the other stuff that we've done in terms of interventions online is really about trying to improve people's sharing decisions by their own lights. Not like even sort of softer, even lighter touch than this. Like, we've done all this work. It's really been led by my colleague here, David Rand, and his co-author, Gordon Pennycook, but I've been involved in the field parts of it, actually doing it in the wild. I've done all this work saying, hey, people actually do care about sharing accurate information online. We're not entirely in this kind of post-truth world that people imagine, where no one cares whether what they're sharing is true or false. If you ask people, they say, accuracy is really important. I want to be sharing content that's accurate. But of course, in the moment, it's so easy to just like mash the retweet button or, just repost something that people aren't always thinking about it in the moment. So a lot of what we've done has just been trying to kind of remind people that they should be evaluating content based on its accuracy. And just that reminder, obviously, it's totally content neutral. It's totally content general. It's not saying this thing is true, this thing is false. It's saying, hey, just remember, think about accuracy. That can actually improve people's sharing decisions in a lot of ways. And it's really all by their own lights, by their own judgment, just their more considered judgment than their lizard brain clicking retweet.
Well, we could spend the next hour talking about this, and it's an interesting challenge. I would like to, however, especially as a lot of our audience has, experience coming from the sort of survey and research side of the universe. You did some really interesting work around that at Facebook, and I'd like to pick up on that a little bit as well, because one of the things that I know you were looking at here was looking at bias survey samples, how to adjust these things. And obviously Facebook has massive data sets. I mean, probably one of the largest data sets in the world from any company. So perhaps talk a little bit about that. What did you learn, and what was the focus of that effort?
Yeah, so a few different things here. One is this sort of older work when I actually was working at Facebook, helping to use surveys for more metrics, right? So, I mean, thinking about, you mentioned all this, algorithmic ranking. A lot of times people think about, hey, we're just being shown the stuff that is going to produce the highest engagement right in the moment. But actually, these platforms are often a little bit savvier, and they're like, no, we don't want people to just see the stuff that they're going to click on the most. We want this to get at something that's a little bit deeper, so that when they're reflecting on their use of Instagram, or they're reflecting on their use of LinkedIn or Facebook, they're saying, that was actually worthwhile. I'm getting value out of this. And so it can be useful to augment a lot of the actual just behavioral engagement data with survey data. So that is a big part of the picture. But who actually is going to respond to the surveys? It's not a random sample of your users. So you try to do work to correct that to match the actual distribution of characteristics of your users. As you said, one of the advantages you have is a bunch of data, right? In so many settings where we're doing survey work, you don't know that much about the population, right? So if you're trying to survey all Americans, or more challenging, you're trying to survey people in a country where there's not as rich, say, government census data, you might know, hey, in the end, I should have kind of this distribution of age approximately among my survey respondents. And maybe I know some other things that I should have approximately this distribution of people's characteristics. Oh, they should be spread out among the regions of this country in a certain way to match the population. But I don't know that much about the target population. So even if I ask more and more questions of these survey respondents about their characteristics, I can't necessarily use that to reweight them to make them more representative of the population because I don't know that much about the population. But somewhere like Facebook, and actually a lot of companies that are surveying their own customers, they know so much about their own customers. And so they can use a much, much richer model of who's responding to my surveys and use that to correct for things. So that was part of what we were really able to do there. And I think is, now becoming very common practice for surveys of your own customers, where you know so much more about them, right? So you can say, okay, given everybody's activity levels, given the characteristics of their network, given all the things that we might know about them, in the case of somewhere like Facebook, a lot of reporting has suggested that, every object that exists on Meta platforms has a 1,000-dimensional representation. So you could ask in that dense representation, which types of users are more likely to be responding to this survey, and then kind of correct for that to match the distribution over those 1,000 dimensions in the population. That could start to get challenging. 1,000 dimensions is a lot, but you do have that rich data at least. So at least you could know a lot of the ways that your population and your sample are different than each other, and exactly how you could make the sample characteristics match the population characteristics. So I'd say that's a lot of what I had worked on there. And in some ways, it's, that was a real advantage that we had in that setting over a lot of more traditional survey settings.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, to some extent, Facebook and a few other companies are sort of outliers in this regard, right? Because they have enormous amount of telemetry data on customers. And it's the bigger thing I take away from it to some degree is that once again, we're seeing this informational gap open up between companies that have tremendous amount of data about their customers, and frankly, in the case of Facebook, as a digital product, have that data fairly well organized, right, by nature. And you contrast that with non-digital companies, especially so the atoms, not bits companies. And they have those two setbacks. First of all, they may have very limited information about their customers to start with. The data they do have is extremely fragmented, and therefore that's you're missing that cohesive view, and that still represents probably 95% of the economy. Let's face it, we've got these Facebook's the outlier; they're not the norm, and so our perspective would be that one of the big advantages now with generative AI technologies is that you can start to fill in the gap and organize the data that you don't have because you lack that. So to some extent, what companies are going to be doing when they have this imperfect data universe is they're going to be filling it in using prediction. Because essentially, as long as you can assign probabilities to everything, you can start to fill in the gaps. So if you're looking at it from a Facebook perspective, you have the data, which is a big asset. If you're looking at it from the perspective of, say, a manufacturer, you don't have that data. What you have to do is you have to essentially model what that data would be. You have to fill in the gaps. And that's where I think increasingly generative, and I use generative in the broadest possible sense, not the sort of chat GPT notion of it, but generative AI technologies and predictive AI technologies can be deployed to sort of fill in the gaps. And then maybe companies that lack that core data set are still going to have the opportunity to perform much more sophisticated analysis, and try and understand what they're really learning about their customers. After the last few elections, we've kind of learned to become somewhat questionable about polling data because of presumably similar problems as well. There's issues of sample bias, and they've been very hard to correct. But probabilistic modeling might get us out of the bind,
or at least that's a key to quantifying how much uncertainty we have there, right? That
Right.
And I think that's where, the polling data in the political setting has been off by a bunch, but at least a lot of the sophisticated modelers there have said, well, look, it's been off by kind of about how much it's been off historically. Like it was, within our model of the typical errors from this kind of thing, right? And so I think, having a probabilistic model can really help you in that regard. Because you mentioned the generative thing, one angle I think about there is, and also for manufacturers, is cases where there might be some data that's very relevant, but can't necessarily actually be shared with me for, regulatory reasons potentially, or it could be a lot to jump through to get that data to me. And so instead, you might use synthetic data that has a bunch of characteristics of the real data, but is going to be, privacy preserving and easy to analyze in the sense that it looks like real data rather than it being like, oh, here's some statistics that describe the data. No, here's a synthetic data set that is sort of like what you would have if you had the real data. And a lot of what you're going to do with it is going to give you the same answer as if you had the real data. So now that turns out to be a really hard challenge to get, right? To both have it be privacy preserving and have it give you the same answer to lots of different queries you might have of the data. But I think it's a super active area and a case where you really do need some generative model. You need to be able to generate this synthetic data that has some kind of important similarity to the truth.
Yeah. So I think, this is an emerging area, right? We're certainly developing new capabilities all the time. But I want to bring you back perhaps to a more fundamental human problem, which is at the end of the day, data as a way of making decisions is still relatively immature for our species, right? I don't know how long we've had developing ways of telling stories around the campfire or anecdotes as being the primary way of communication. And then, we start to introduce the idea of data-driven decision-making probably 20, 30 years ago wasn't even an idea. And now we're in an era where we're having to go and inform people in the boardroom around the executive table about what data as the primary mechanism for making choices and decisions. And we're not very good at that. I mean, I think if you spend any time working with corporations or even very senior leadership teams, you encounter this problem where when the data is taking a different tangent than preconceived notions, and it kind of almost goes back to your original comments about how people process contrarian points of view, right, in social media. Well, nobody's immune from that. That's human beings. You go into the boardroom and you say, you all think X and the data's telling us Y. We're finding, and I'm sure this is an experience for everyone who is in the data and analytics business, that's not easy. This is not trivial to get people to consider alternative points of view than some that are extremely well developed. Now, you imagine your typical profile of a C-suite executive. They're most likely in their 50s, maybe older. They've been doing this for 30 years. They've got to where they are because of their judgment based on pattern matching, right? They look at new situations through an informed and experienced lens, form good judgments, make good decisions. Now you have data tools coming along saying, or even worse, artificial intelligence tools, which are predictive models, which aren't really facts at all in some people's minds. They're just predictions, saying, no, you should go left instead of right. What are we going to do? And how can we communicate better? Are there any lessons learned here in terms of approaching this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point, especially considering the perspective of the executive and treating them as rational. Because there are so many cases where you can be presented with data that supposedly is telling you exactly what decision you should be making, right? Or that your decision somehow should be a function just of that data. But things are missing, right? It's not actually telling you the whole story. So it can be quite rational to say, hey, this conclusion disagrees with, my prior belief here. I can reason in both directions. One is I revise my prior belief. Another one is to say, hey, actually, something must be missing, right? So people sometimes say, one man's modus ponens is another's modus tollens, right? So I could be saying, okay, I believe P implies Q, therefore Q, but, I could also say, hold on, I know Q isn't true, therefore there's something wrong with the premises, right? So, so I think there can be a kind of rationality there, and that it's also often the case that the people presenting data, they have a perspective, they have a point of view, they're trying to maybe nudge a decision in some direction, and so executives have to be cautious about just going from, oh, the data say this, therefore we should do that. So I think there are some parts of that are very reasonable, but then of course a lot of it can come down to other things that have more to do with ego and the process of just deferring to the highest paid person's opinion, or the hippo, as Ronnie Kohavi likes to call it, right? So, so I think that I think there's some reality to the idea that data-driven decision making sometimes is asking a little bit too much of the data and not reflecting some of the other kind of valuable pattern matching that executives might do. So there is something to that.
Well, what if we simply regard it as narrowing the decision space at the end of the day, right? So our objective is not to steer towards an emphatic absolute answer, because that doesn't exist. And you're never going to have, complete certainty in pretty much any aspect of business decision making. But if at the end of the day we're able to use decision support technologies to narrow the decision space, and maybe even just cut off the edges of the bell curve, cut off the extremes. In other words, remove the possibility of making an extremely bad choice. And so we're going to improve our decision making. And by the way, that can be applied to frontline employees as well. I mean, one of the biggest challenges that companies face is that the judgment of their teams, especially in our field where you engage with customers, is notoriously terrible. And that's not because they're bad people. It's because human bias, lack of data. If you're on the phone to a customer and the customer sounds like everything's great, salespeople, we call it happy ears, right? If it's salespeople, you've got a good relationship with someone, they don't want to tell you bad news. So we process things based on this, developed sense as human beings as to how we should process this conversation. I'm having a good conversation with someone. Maybe they'll buy my product, or maybe they'll renew my contract. If the data is pointing in a different direction, that may not change their perspective, but it might shear off the worst possible decisions. It might essentially move them off the decision space where they could make a really bad decision and nudge them into a space which is better. And that might be sufficient for us to say, look, we're going to improve our decision making from executives in the boardroom and frontline employees 10, 20, 30% over the next year or two. And that could be very meaningful in a large corporation. We're not going to be right, and we're not going to turn people 180 degrees, but we're going to smooth off the rough edges.
Yeah, and I think one of the big questions here is, when do we really get complementarity between the decision support tools or AI and humans? So when do you actually get cases where, the humans know something, they have experience, they have access to data that the AI, the predictive model, does not have access to, but the predictive model can avoid a lot of other problems that humans might have, and it has access to a lot of data as well. When do you actually get complementarity between those two? And so far, a lot of the evidence from kind of lab experiment settings, where people are putting people in a lab doing a task, and they give them AI support. In a lot of cases, if the AI is sort of better than the baseline human at doing it, it's not that the human then becomes better than the AI. So there's not complementarity. It's just that the human kind of catches up to the AI somewhat, right? So that the human's performance is improved by the AI, but not in this way that we might hope, where there's actually, the human plus the AI is better than either one alone. And my colleagues here, Abdullah Al-Matuk and Tom Malone and their student, Michelle Vaquero, have this meta-analysis of hundreds of experiments of this kind that have now been done. And human AI complementarity only happens a small fraction of the time. So that's part of what we'd really like to achieve. And some of that's going to be about improving the models, but some of it is really about improving the human AI interaction, so that you make that complementarity emerge.
Well, that's a bigger topic than we have time for today. I really would love to dive into that a little bit more, because that's an interesting topic, but we sort of run up against our time stop. Dean, thanks very much. Fascinating conversation, very, very unique perspective, and congratulations on your tenure decision as well at MIT. That's quite an accomplishment.
Cool. Thanks a lot. Yeah. Really great conversation. It'd be great to continue it more another time.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to the CX Iconoclast from OCX Cognition. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you won't miss any of our thought-provoking conversations. And please get in touch if you want to learn more about what OCX Cognition's predictive CX analytics platform can do for your business by providing complete insights into every account, continuously updated and connected to operations. You'll find contact info in the show notes.